We are studying the stories of Jesus. The name of this study is Who is This Guy Named Jesus? And we're doing the whole entire gospel message. All right? And that seems a little daunting, like it might be just a little bit much to put in your head, to get your head all the way around. All right? But it really isn't. Because each one of the books is somewhat specialized. And once you get to look at what's there, for instance, let's just do some memory type games. All right? And there is no wrong answer because nobody's expects you to know this, but you will by the time we get done. For instance, which book of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, would be the story of the 10 lepers that were healed all at one time?
Mark?
Nope.
Oh.
Nope, but let it down. Remember one of the clues. One of the clues is one of the lepers is a Samaritan. Remember?
Oh.
9 of them go to the priest to be certified as clean, and one of them comes back to say thank you, and he is the Samaritan. So which gospel would have that one?
Luke.
Luke does. Luke does. Why? Because Luke is Gentile, not Jewish, and he is actually putting together the story from a Gentile or non-Jewish tradition. Okay? For instance, where's the story of the Good Samaritan? The guy who stopped to help the Jewish man who was attacked and was near death and paid for him to be in the care of the innkeeper and all the other guys. Where would you find that?
Luke.
I just thought you might jump right in on that. Look, it's the same story. It's a Luke. Okay? Where would we find the story of the man named Lazarus, not the dead guy, at least not at first, who was so poor and was so sick that he sat out in the street outside the rich man's house and the dogs licked his wounds and he wished for the crumbs off of the table?
John? Yeah. That's one of these.
I
Mark.
was going to go back to my
Luke.
my go-to guy. Luke. Why? Why? Because although Matthew says, blessed are the poor in spirit in the Beatitudes, what does Luke say?
This is poor.
Blessed are the poor, and cursed are the rich. Ooh, a little different twist on the whole thing. Now you see, it kind of gets cool because you say, well, why does one say one way and one say another way? Which one's right and which one's wrong? They're both right. Both right. Because Jesus can't be captured inside a numbered series of pages in one book. He's too big for that. And the best that you can do, the best that you can understand, and I'm talking to you, all the way around, the best you can do is get what fits into your head. You follow? You're not going to know it all. You're not going to understand everything that Jesus is, but you'll get more acquainted with him as we go along. Now we start in the Gospel of John, just because that's so weird. Remember what we said? John tells us, for instance, it's the only place we can find that Jesus had a 3-year ministry. Okay? Did he say it straight out and say he taught for 3 years or more? No, we have to kind of dig it out. He went to 3 Passover festivals in Jerusalem in the Gospel of John. So that meant he went to the first one, and then. Okay, he went 3 times to the annual festival. That means he was teaching for 3 years. Doesn't say it out loud, but we can start to dig out. So the Gospel of John is a very interesting book because there's a lot of things in it that are different than the other 3 books. And I want to give you one silly example, all right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We call those the synoptic gospels because they share so much information. They have a synergy. They go together, all right? John stands sort of off to the side. It's not one of the synoptic gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke say that on Thursday evening, Jesus came into the upper room and shared a special festival feast. What was that called? Passover. Okay? He shared the Passover meal. And that meant that they went through the entire Passover tradition. It's a long process, a full meal. Everybody ends up being very satisfied. Wow, it's a banquet, it's a feast. Okay? The Gospel of John specifically says that that did not constitute a Passover meal. Now, does that mean one of our books is wrong? And if so, which one? Passover did not happen until the next day. Passover did not take place until the evening of Friday and not on Thursday. Okay? So what? Somebody could say, there's an error in the Bible. You can't believe it because there's a problem. Now, let me just explain to you how the thing works. Okay, here's the way it works. This is a calendar. It shows the days of the week. And it shows where Passover is celebrated in the three Gospels. On the normal three synoptic Gospels, the lamb was sacrificed on Thursday afternoon. On Thursday evening, they had their Passover celebration. Remember? Okay? This is my body that was broken for you. This is my blood, the blood of the new covenant. Take it all and drink of it. And then, that same evening, he was arrested and taken for his trial. And on Friday, he hung on the cross. On Saturday, he was in the tomb. And Sunday morning, he came out of the tomb. Easter Sunday morning. Okay. So the question is this Passover or is this Passover? Because in the Gospel of John, they just had a meal together, and instead of having communion, what does John tell that none of the rest of the Gospels share about what Jesus did that night? Justin, you should be able to answer this one hands down. What did Jesus do for his disciples on Thursday night in John that doesn't happen anyplace else? Remember what we did on Passover?
We did the washing of the feet.
Washed his disciples' feet.
He was like,
I got it. Well, I was hanging in there for a little while. He was I was a little concerned there for a little while. I was going to come through, but he did. Okay? Made it. So, why does John say this was not the Passover? Jesus was hanging on the cross until sundown, or pretty close to sundown, went in the tomb on that Friday evening, and this was the start of Passover. Any ideas? John? Okay, here's the story. What are you allowed to do in the Jewish tradition on the Sabbath day? Nothing. Glenn hit it perfectly. You can't even have so much as a straight pin in the cuff of your trousers, or your robe, or whatever you're working on, and carry that with you through the day because that's work. Carrying that pin around is work. Why do the Jews in our community walk to the synagogue on Saturday?
driving the car's work.
What was that?
Driving the car's work, maybe. I don't know.
Driving the car, pushing the pedal is work.
Turn the wheel.
And they all live close enough where they can walk. Shut up.
And if they live within 2 miles, they can walk. Walking is not work if you're going to the synagogue or to the temple. All right, you can walk 2 miles. Okay, so
Because walking burns calories.
who
In theory.
feeds the children on Sabbath? Who feeds the pets? Who takes care of the livestock? Who takes care of the...
The
You do
Gentile.
it ahead of time, you get everything prepared. That way, when they have to eat, there's no food preparation done but without refrigeration, how many days ahead can you prepare? 1 day. Things begin to go bad in that temperature without any refrigeration or anything. So what happens if you have Passover here and the Sabbath here? Ooh, you got a problem.
So you're telling me they had to make breakfast, lunch, and dinner ahead of time? And you can't reheat it?
No, it didn't heat it. It was,
That'd be work.
It was like cured meats
It
and
was-
stuff and bread.
We're not talking about now, we're talking about then.
yeah.
They didn't have a microwave, you couldn't just.
Well, I mean, they had a fire.
But they got very much strict rules even today.
So they would cure the meats and they would have
Yeah.
bread and
Yeah.
maybe I don't know, today
It was a simple meal. It
Salt was
was
preserved
not
for
a
a
banquet.
certain
all
amount
right?
of time.
Yeah.
And so what's the rule about Passover? What can you do on Passover?
Nothing but
Nothing.
and drink.
Nothing. So if you try and prepare a meal and you're ready to do nothing of work on Passover, what are you going to do to get ready for the Sabbath day? Once in a while, because the Passover is calculated on the phases of the moon, the first full moon after the dust and dust and dust and dust and dust. And I could go into all of that. That's not important. All right? It moves around. It's not like December 25th. It always happens on December 25th.
Does it really?
It's more like July 4th that hits wherever it hits in the week, whatever it is. And if it hits on a Thursday, then you get a really long weekend. And if it hits on Tuesday, then you're stuck. You've got a holiday in the middle of the week. Okay? So, Sabbath moves. Once in a while, it causes a real problem because if it lines up just before the Sabbath day, you could be really in trouble, all right? It really makes it very stressful on families, especially with lots of kids and lots of dependents and that kind of stuff. So what they did is they made an executive decision on the days when these things happened, they would move Passover to the Sabbath. Follow? Now there's only one day that's going to be kept holy, and so they moved the day of preparation one day over. John, he's a stickler for the traditions, he's a stickler for the way things are going to be done, realizes that on Thursday may have been the traditional day of preparation for the Passover, but it wasn't the official Passover. And so Jesus is hanging on the cross as the sacrificial lamb while those 600,000 sacrificial lambs are being sacrificed in the temple. Now, you say, I didn't realize there were those kinds of differences between the books. Anybody know that? Does it make a whole lot of difference? No, but it's so interesting. John has a whole different perspective on this miracle of Jesus. The miracle of Jesus is just phenomenal. As I told the folks we were having a lesson, I introduced this last week. John says, okay, that he is never going to say anything that he hasn't seen or heard with his own eyes and ears. And so it's almost like from 2018, we take a microphone and we move it through time down to 30 AD, and we put the microphone on the table with this long cord, and we're listening to the voices of who says what in all those rooms. Because John said, I'm not going to tell you anything, except what I have seen and what I have heard. Who else says that? Is there any other book in the story of Jesus that says that? Did Luke even meet Jesus? Oh, we already went through that last week. He came along later. He came in the church era after Jesus had already gone back into heaven. So why would Luke go to such work to tell us this story of Jesus? Go through this whole research project. Why would he do this? Do you understand what Luke is? What was that?
The book or the person?
Well, Luke, yeah, tell me about Luke.
Okay.
What is
Yeah, phone a friend.
Yeah, sure. If you want to give up one of the
No,
lines.
don't even look at me. Don't even look at me.
Brian. Yeah.
Who is he? He's a
Doctor.
doctor. He's a physician.
Oh, that's right.
Okay, you didn't go to medical school back in Jesus' day. It wasn't like that. It wasn't like but you got a full education. And as you learned about how the body works and how you can take care of things, you took on the role of being a physician because you were well educated. But that meant that you could have been a lawyer because you got the same education a lawyer would get. You could have been a tremendous merchant. You could have been an accountant because there was all this education that you had gotten all at one group, all right? And so he was a very highly educated fellow. So why would he go to the trouble, the expense, the agony of writing the story of Jesus? Well, let's just think about that for a second. The Gospel of Luke. Let me open the first couple of pages here.
For his friend Theophilus.
Theophilus! Who's Theophilus? I'm writing these things to you, Theophilus, so that you can know the whole story. Who was he?
Oh no, I've never heard. It's speculation, probably.
You are going to know now.
Yay, knowledge.
He was Paul's Roman lawyer.
Oh,
Okay?
that's fascinating.
Because the whole story of Acts, which is the second book that Luke writes to Theophilus, is the story of what is happening through the church development. And about halfway through it, it stops being about the rest of the church and just talks about how Paul is on his way to Rome. If you listen to the book of Luke and the book of Acts, he is writing a legal brief that will be presented to the emperor, the Caesar, at Paul's trial, where his life is going to be on the line. That's why there's no conclusion in the book of Acts. He gets through the hurricane that lasts 14 days, the most incredible hurricane in history, and he survives that. He survives the snake biting him, and I think he's going to die, and finally he doesn't die, but they go to Rome, and that's the end of Acts. There's no conclusion to it. Why? Trial hasn't happened yet. They don't know what's going to be happening for Paul. So Luke and Acts are like a legal brief that is being filed with his lawyer so that he can argue for what actually happened that brought Paul to Rome. You follow? And so we have that kind of background for each one of the books. We can begin to see why they have the character that they do. All right? The Gospel of John is unique because he said, I'm only going to tell you what I have seen and heard. And now I have to admit to you, I stretch the truth. What's the one story in the book of John where John is not there and he tells us exactly what happened? I'm sorry. I promised you one thing and then I broke my word. It happens at the tomb.
No.
No.
It happens on Easter morning.
Yeah, the two women that found
Oh,
Jesus.
Mary Magdalene.
Mary.
Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene.
But they
Who
came
was-
to him first, or him and Peter, was it?
Well, they came to Peter and John,
Peter and John,
after,
I'm saying.
yeah, after they had seen Jesus.
Mm.
Mary Magdalene returns to the tomb. She's crying. She's weeping at the empty tomb. Jesus appears to her. Where have you taken his body? She thought he was the gardener. And there's this thing, I'll take care of him, that kind of thing. And then he says Mary's name, Mary. And she recognizes it as Jesus. And she grabs him around his feet. And he says, don't touch me right now, it's not complete. Go and tell my disciples that you've seen me. Now, who else was there? See, we're talking about voice. We've been talking about who was the witness and who told the story of what was there. Who was there?
Yeah, the other Mary?
No,
Martha?
Martha.
she was all by herself. In this part of the story, right here, she is alone in the garden when Jesus appears. So who's telling the story?
Mary Magdalene.
Mary.
At this point,
Mary. What is the other story in John that doesn't have an I word in it? All right? Happens in the 8th chapter of John. There's a
oh,
story.
the woman caught in adultery,
Uh-huh.
which that one's not even not in all manuscripts.
Uh-huh. Why?
I don't know. Which was
It's like this.
Yeah.
Jonathan's, he's right on. He's doing great, all right? It's 2 eyewitness stories
Mhm.
in John. But the one that happens at the tomb on Easter Sunday morning can only appear in one place, right?
Mhm.
So they take that part of that first person testimony and they slide it into the book of John, staple it in.
Mhm.
Okay, they didn't staple it, but that's the only place where it makes sense. Okay? And then there's this other story, this eyewitness account of the woman who is going to be stoned. All right? And it doesn't get stapled in any place because it doesn't have a particular place. And one place it shows in here, the next place it's pushed in here, and the next place it's pushed in here, and some places it doesn't get in there at all. Jonathan's exactly right.
It's like what they call it, spurious scripture.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a scripture that moves around. It doesn't fit into the book of John the same way as all the rest of the books.
Spurious is like ones
Spurious?
that, yeah, spurious is
Okay.
ones that are like in some manuscripts that they use to translate the Bible, and then they were in some of them but weren't in all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like a lot of verses that have footnotes, like this one was not in, in the original text, or
Okay.
so.
And we have certain ones of those versions we consider to be the more reliable, and so we have sort of a guide that we use to say these are the ones that we really count on, and the rest of them kind of, well, but the story of the woman caught in adultery is one of these stories that moves around through the book. It doesn't show up in any other book, it's in the book of John, but it moves. And so literally what you have is John and Mary's testimony. All right? That's the way you have the book of John. John and Mary's testimony. Okay, so let's just think for a second about John. And I made a claim in one of the piece of paper that has all the heavy underlining on it, that John is a priest. That's a little unusual because most people think he is one of the 12. Do you know the story of the 12?
Paraphrasing. It's not.
Paraphrase. Jesus chose 12 disciples. And even though there were a lot of people coming and going into his circle, they stayed the 12. All right? Now I'm using my fingers here instead of the chalk, but the 12 is a capital T 12. All right? It's a name that was given to all the disciples who were originally named as Jesus' followers. All right? The word 12, capital T 12, appears 23 times in the gospel stories. All right? The 12 were a very, very clearly defined group. And the Gospel of John, again, we remember John is never named as the writer of the book. He's called the beloved disciple, and he doesn't actually name himself as John. Refers to those guys over there who were the 12. The 12 went with him so and so. All right? So, in the sense that he doesn't count himself in with the 12. So how does that make him? What does that make him? Bad? Oh, no.
Man.
Not,
An outsider.
he's sort of an outsider because he's a second group of Jesus followers. Remember, he started with 12, went 72. How many were in the upper room for Passover? Any idea? They were about the same group that was there when the Holy Spirit came at Pentecost. And how many were in the room that day? 120. 120.
There was 120 at Passover?
It was a big room.
Well, yeah, I just sometimes when I learned these stuff when I was younger, the numbers didn't stick, so.
Yeah. This was almost like a fortress house. It was a very large house. The room where they had the upper room, Passover, you want to call it that way, was probably about twice the size of this room. All right? It's a big house. It was up on the second floor. The people lived downstairs, so it was a very big house.
People were a lot smaller back then too.
Well, and they didn't take up as much
They
space.
didn't take as much space.
They didn't have large screen TVs that they had to leave room for, and that kind of thing. So, and they didn't have a garage. So, I'm sorry. It was a very different world.
Mhm.
Question?
I think, I don't know.
Sure.
I might be about to sound extremely
No,
stupid.
no.
All right.
So, we're talking the same weekend that Jesus was crucified.
Correct.
So is Passover separate from the Last Supper?
The Last Supper that we traditionally share on Thursday, we call that Maundy Thursday. Okay?
Oh, Last Supper's Monday, Thursday.
Uh-huh.
Okay,
Last
I always
Supper's
forget that that's what, that they did the same thing, it's coming from a denominational church, you don't focus on Monday, Thursday, you just focus on like Passover. How Islam was it?
Now, that really means that we're not Jewish. Okay? Because we're celebrating on Maundy, Thursday, and Jesus is hanging on the cross as a sacrificial lamb the next day, when he should have been on Thursday afternoon if it was actually Passover.
Gotcha.
But he was hanging as the great sacrifice that would end all sacrifice. And as soon as he said, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit, and the temple veil was torn in two from the top to the bottom. Do you understand what that means? Do you follow what the tradition is on that? You know what that means? Okay. When someone who was precious to you, someone you loved with all your heart, died, the way you indicate your grief is you take your robe, Jewish now, up here by the throat where you stick your head through, you grab it with your hands and you rip it with all your might. And the ripping sound all the way down, and you expose your body through this ripping process of grief. All right? The high priest, when he decided they were going to kill Jesus because he claimed to be God's son, took his robes and tore them out of grief that somebody had blasphemed. All right? So it's a gut-wrenching experience. Even today, if you go to a Jewish funeral, they will pin a piece of cloth on your jacket or on your shirt. And when you feel that rush of grief, you take that piece of cloth and you rip it during the funeral as a way of showing that your heart is broken. All right? The only covering that God ever had was the veil of the temple. It separated his place from the rest of the temple where the priests worked from day to day. And that's why it tore from the top all the way to the bottom at the moment of Jesus' death. God ripped away the only covering he ever had in his display of grief. Okay? Now, all of those things, and who is sitting there at the foot of the cross watching this whole thing happen? Which of the followers of Jesus? Are any of the 12 there? What do you think? John, what do you think? Were the 12 there? They were his closest followers, right? Suppose they would be there?
No.
Mm.
They weren't.
Too dangerous. Why?
They get killed too.
They get killed right along with it. There'd be a cross right next to them, and they'd be hung up there on the cross the same way. Because they were co-conspirators according to the law. Now Jesus protected them. When he was arrested, he said, "It's just me that you want. Let them go."
He's another droid doing
I'm the one you're after. And they took him away to have his trial. And so, but they went into hiding. Why didn't the beloved disciple go into hiding?
Because Bart wasn't one of the 12.
He wasn't one of the 12. He was an insider in the city of Jerusalem. He was acceptable anywhere. He didn't have anything to worry about from the authorities because he was in the high priest's family. Now let's just think about this for a second. How many Bobs are there around here? It gets really confusing. Bob this and Bob that. We have to talk about Bob B, Bob D, Bob K. Okay? We almost need to do that with John's in the scripture. Okay? Who was the first one that comes into our story that is named John?
John Baptist.
John the Bee.
The bee. Sounds
The
bad.
baptizer. He's not Baptist.
Mhm.
He is the baptizer. Okay? So that's John number 1. There is a disciple that comes along very quickly who is the son of James, who were the sons of Zebedee. What was his name?
John.
John, the son of Zebedee.
Yep, James John. Sons of Zebedee.
Mm-hmm. He was one of the 12. What was his profession?
Fisherman.
He was a fisherman from Capernaum, up north of Galilee, up in the area, in the Galilean region, not down by Jerusalem. They dressed different, they talked different, they had a different uniform, if you want to put it that way, and that made them stand out in a crowd.
Understand.
And it didn't smell too good. Okay, because it smelled like fish. At least we think so. So where does this beloved disciple come in? And how do we know how he fits? Take your Bibles, if you have them with you. Turn to the 4th chapter of Acts. Okay. We have a story here. Hey, how you doing, Joe Beth? Come and join us. We have a story in the 4th chapter of Acts. And you have to understand, Luke is a very good historian, and he is putting names in that are familiar so that you could connect the dots and you could see things are happening. All right?
So that's 4.
Acts 4, verse 1. The priest and the captain of the temple guard and the Sadducees came up to Peter and John while they were speaking to the people in the temple. Wait a minute. John 1? No. John the Bee has already been beheaded. So he's not going to be around anymore. Who is this?
God.
What was that? the son of
The beloved.
Zebedee. We're going to call him John Z. He's the son of Zebedee. All right? What are the nicknames that they give to James and John, the sons of Zebedee? You remember what they call them?
Yeah. I'll let you answer though.
The sons of
Thunder.
Thunder.
I thought you were about to say the actual term for it.
No, Sons of Thunder.
Okay.
That's right.
There was
Son.
another name for it, or the Greek or the Hebrew word for the sons of thunder.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they were called loudmouths.
Yeah.
Greek is called loud. All right?
Where did we?
Okay, so this is Peter and one of the 12, John the Z. While they were speaking to the people, they were arrested. They were greatly disturbed because the apostles were teaching the people, proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection of the dead. They seized Peter and John Z, and because it was evening, they put them in jail until the next day. But many who heard the message believed. So the number of men who believed grew to about 5,000. This thing is really growing fast. People are just coming over to believe in Jesus one right after the other. All right, verse 5. The next day the rulers, the elders, and the teachers of the law met in Jerusalem. Annas, the high priest, was there, and so were Caiaphas. Who's Caiaphas?
Is he the former high priest?
Yeah, they traded back and forth. Annas and Caiaphas traded the job back and forth. It was a compromise that allowed them to stay in power. It was a power sharing process, okay? So the high priest was there, and so was Caiaphas, John and Alexander, and others in the high priest family. Whoa, wait a minute. Who's that? So were Caiaphas, John, Alexander, and others in the high priest family. Is this John B? Is it John Z? It's John P.
John Priest.
John the priest.
What verse is that?
All right. It is verse 6. Annas the high priest was there, so was Caiaphas, John, Alexander, and others in the high priest family. They had Peter and John. Whoa, this is getting confusing. Who's this? Peter and John Z brought into them and began to question him, by what power or what name do you do this? Then Peter gives them this wonderful sermon, all right? So who is John P?
Part of the high priest family?
He's the one you can't touch.
What?
You can't arrest John P. He can go anywhere he wants to. He is in the high priest family.
Although they found out he was a Jesus supporter, would they, disown him or something? I don't know.
Honestly, I'm going to do a trick, and it's nothing I can confirm. God just closed their eyes to how dangerous this guy was actually to their family and let him work. I think he was young. I know he was young. I know he was not a priest, so he wasn't held to the same accountability. If you understand what the words were, there were the teachers of the law. What were some of the words there? I think verse 3, let's go down through it again.
Yeah.
Who was there? The apostles were teaching. They seized John the same evening. There were Ananias, there were elders and teachers and rulers. All right? John P. is actually called John the Elder in Christian tradition. And that's where it comes from. John the Elder. He is scripturally solid. He is 100% knowledgeable about the law and the priesthood and all the traditions. He is this incredibly gifted individual. But when Jesus looks from the cross and says, son, behold your mother, mother, behold your son, he's actually making Mary a priest's son. You follow? What does that mean? What's she going to have to worry about from that point forward? She's under the umbrella of the protection of the Jewish system. Okay? And why does that not sound shocking? Because Mary was already in the priestly family. How do we know that? Stretch your brains a little bit. Help me. How was she related to a priest?
She's related to David.
Well, that's through Matthew. Matthew tells us that, and that's Joseph's connection.
Oh, Joseph.
Joseph goes back to Bethlehem because he is in the family of David. That gives him the king DNA. Gives him the king DNA.
So maybe her genealogy is back to the Levites.
In the family of Aaron. Now, why do we know? Why would the family of Aaron? How does that connect? Come on, Pastor Bob, you're stretching the whole thing. You can't make this stuff up. Can you? Who's his cousin? Who baptized him? John the B. How did he get to be Jesus' cousin?
Sisters. Her cousin, his mom was cousin to
Was
Mary.
cousin to Mary.
Yep.
And Zechariah, her husband, was a priest. So, in the house of Aaron, there was often, to try and keep the holiness of the priesthood, they often married in the same family of Aaron. In fact, if you went to Jerusalem today, you would walk by one of the gates close to where the man who had been invalid for 38 years was healed, little Bethsaida, and right at the edge of that pool is a building. They said that's where the family of Mary lived when they were in Jerusalem, when he was serving as priest, Mary's father. So Jesus has the DNA from David, who is going to sit on David's throne forever and ever and ever. And he has the DNA from Aaron's family as the priesthood. And so, was John the Baptist a priest? No, he wasn't trained as a priest. He wasn't working as a priest. He was in the family of a priest. He could have been a priest, but God called him to be a prophet instead of a temple priest. And he baptized his cousin and testified to him that this was the one who's going to come to you, that's going to follow. You see how John all of a sudden makes all of this stuff make sense, how it all kind of comes together? John has some very interesting stories and some things that aren't there. Why doesn't John have Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane on the last night? Remember how the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, call of him going into the inner parts of the Garden of Gethsemane and taking three disciples, Peter, James, and John Z.
Because he wasn't there.
Peter, James, and John were the three that kind of hung out together. All right? And they go into the inner part of the thing, and Jesus goes on in beyond them and starts to pray at the big rock. Father, not my will, but thine be done. Take this cup away from me. Not my will, thine be done. Okay? He comes back and finds Peter, James, and John Z asleep. Can't you stay with me 1 hour and pray? Don't you realize what the stakes are here? Don't you get the idea? They've just had Passover. We've had so much to eat. We've had this cup of wine and this cup of wine, and you had 4 cups of wine during the Passover meal. And it's a little hard to stay with it afterwards. So Jesus goes back and prays again. Comes back, they're asleep again. Come on, guys, get with the plan! Or something like that. And then he goes back and prays again, take this cup away for the third time. Why doesn't John P. tell that story?
Wasn't my witness.
Wasn't there.
It wasn't there. Now,
Because you said there was only two stories he told that he wasn't physically present for, but he had them as first person witness
Accounts.
statements.
mhm.
Yeah.
Why wasn't he there? I can't tell you. But it was very, very important that he was not there.
That would have been the association of Jesus, that probably would have gotten her in a lot of trouble.
Could have crossed the line very well, Kyle. Could have been right there if he'd have been caught right in the presence of Jesus. Now, he was standing there when the soldiers came. Who's the only one who tells us the name of the high priest's servant that is struck down and his ears cut off? You know which gospel that's in?
Jones?
John.
Does he know his name?
He's got him. He's a partner. He's a buddy. He knows Malchus very well.
Family servant, probably.
Uh-huh.
So,
He may have even worked in his household for a while. There goes Malchus. Malchus, he's now all deformed and everything. So no, I want you to get the idea. Where do we get who's the book that tells us about Lazarus and Mary and Martha? It's John. Who tells us about Zacchaeus? It's John. Who tells us about Joseph of Arimathea? Where does Joseph of Arimathea come in? Do you know where that comes in?
He's the one
You
that
got any idea where is he?
he asked Jesus to be born again, about being, or what to be saved.
No, at least we don't think so.
Okay.
Joseph of Arimathea was probably pretty elderly.
Oh,
He
he
didn't-
was the one
Nicodemus.
religious tomb.
That
He paid for the,
Joseph of Arimathea gave Jesus his tomb.
I'm thinking Nicodemus. That's
Yeah,
what I was-
Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea took Jesus down from the cross, lowered him down, and prepared his body for burial, and the very last shades of night on Friday evening, the day of preparation. Now, how do you know when sunset falls and Passover begins? Do you remember how that happens? You know how, there's no alarm clock or anything like that, so how do you know when it goes from being Friday, the day of preparation, to the Sabbath day
So
on
no.
Friday night?
Will it be like a big like horn type thing?
Well, they did blow the shofar. That's called the shofar. But the way they did it is they put two strings on man's hand. A light-colored string, a white one, and a dark one.
You couldn't see one.
And when the light gets so dim that you can't tell the color of the dark one, and they look alike, you go back to black and white, your vision, you lose the color of your vision in the dusk, all right? When they can't tell the color of the strings, they blow the shofar.
Interesting.
Mhm. So that's the way you tell sundown back in the day before you had wristwatches.
Oh.
Okay? Two stringed. Can't see the color? You blow the shofar. The Passover has started.
Or Google Maps before it turns dark.
I'm sorry?
Or Google Maps when it turns dark.
So,
They have that going.
who tells us how many herbs and spices were buried with the body of Jesus?
John.
John. He was the only one who was the eyewitness. All the rest of the disciples were locked up in John P.'s house with the windows and doors barred. All right? How many pounds of spices were put with Jesus' body?
Wait, pounds of spices?
How many pounds of spices? Wrapped up in the cloth that surrounded his body were all kinds of very, very expensive herbs and spices. I mean, they had just cleaned out all of the merchants. See, to get a picture, I shouldn't do this, but we'll take a minute. All right, this is Jerusalem. All right, The temple. This is where Jesus was arrested over here in the Garden of Gethsemane, down in the bottom of the Kidron Valley. They follow through here. They walk up to Caiaphas' house on the top of the hill. Remember how the high priest lived in the top of the hill where it stunk a lot less than... I'm sorry.
You know what moves down here?
Everything goes downhill because everything is falling to the center. This is the Trophial Valley. Everything from this whole thing falls down through this sort of a river stream that goes out through here. And what's the name of this hole in the wall down here?
Dung gate.
The Dung Gate. You know what goes to the Dung Gate? It ain't good. It ain't good. It's not good. It's not.
Feces.
And what's this down here below the outer wall? What is this?
The Gehenna or
Gehenna.
Gehenna.
The Valley of Gehenna. All right?
Translates that.
And it's the garbage dump. It's where everything goes. The trash, the dung, and the whole thing. All right? So where was Jesus crucified? Well, he went to trial in Caiaphas' house. In the trial at Caiaphas' house, they take him down this walkway. This is actually a wall across here that connects Caiaphas' house up here on the high part of the hill, over the top of the valley, and straight into the temple compound. It just avoids having to go down into the stinky part of the city.
So it's a big bridge.
It's a bridge. It's a conduit. It's
Like a
an
skyway.
aqueduct, or whatever you want to call it.
Probably not.
They followed the aqueduct across here to the temple compound. This is where the Sanhedrin met in the temple in the colonnades of Solomon. They walked Jesus through the temple compound to this square outfit right here. This is called the Fortress of Antonia. It is the Roman garrison in Jerusalem. And it sits right on the top of the wall of the temple. And why does it sit on the wall of the temple? So that they can look down into the temple and see if there's a riot starting, and they can just pour the soldiers out of the barracks down to try and control the riots in the temple compound. Okay? So the Fortress of Antonia is a very special place, and it sits right on the wall of the temple compound in Jerusalem. So when he is tried, Pilate says, "You're from Galilee. I'm going to send you back to Herod and let him decide." So where did they go? Back to the temple compound, across the bridge. Herod's temple's here, or Herod's palace is here. Jesus does not even look at Herod. Totally ignores him. Doesn't answer a question, doesn't have anything. Absolutely just stonewalls completely. Herod said, "Then forget it, I'm sending you back to Pilate." Back across the bridge. Temple compound, Fortress San Antonio, where he's beaten, flogged, humiliated in every way. They put the cross on his shoulder. They walk out of the Fortress of Antonio and through the city streets, through Herod's gate. You following? Okay. There's a hill that starts real low on this side and ramps up till it's real high right here in this spot. But it's outside the city wall. It's here, about the height of my hand in proportion. So they climbed up the slope to the top of this hill out here, and that's where he was crucified. It's called the place of the skull, or Golgotha. All right? This place right here is a gigantic gate in the wall. It's called the Damascus Gate, because anybody that wants to go to Damascus goes out that. It's the I-75 or 95, whatever, heading for Damascus. Everybody went out through that. And it was the marketplace for the entire city of Jerusalem. Imagine what's going on. Passover, 600,000 sacrifices on Friday. Marketplace is here. It's spilled out all over the whole outside of the city. People selling things. I mean, they're selling lambs, they're selling spices, they're selling all these other kinds of things. So Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus take his body from the cross here The marketplace is right there. As far as from here to the other end of the building. They go down and they buy 75 pounds of spices. That is a small fortune. And they wrap all those things up in the Jewish tradition with the body and place it in the tomb. At the very moment that Friday comes to an end, and they no more than finish, and the shofar is blown. End of the first day he was in the tomb. That counts as the first day, because it hadn't blown yet. When he was laid and the stone was closed, it was still the first day. First day. Calculate how many hours now. We gotta watch this. Very interesting. How many hours? Let's say a half an hour. But it's still in that first day. Saturday is the second day. What happens on Easter morning? He's put in the tomb here. He's in the tomb on Saturday. What happens on Easter Sunday morning?
Tomb opens.
He comes back to life. Tomb opens, he walks out. Just moments after the sunrise, which counts as the third day. All right? When the Bible says the Son of God will not see decay, what it means is he will not be in the tomb long enough for his body to completely dissolve, like Lazarus' body was in the tomb for 4 days. There wasn't anything about his body that didn't just reek. You haven't ever.
Seems like a waste on those spices.
What was that?
Seems like a waste on those spices.
Yeah, it really was.
Because,
Except I really think that's part of what the image
Yeah.
on the shroud is. I really do think. I don't think there was, it was a chemical reaction like nothing this world has ever known.
Like that much blood and that much, and all those herbs and spices mixing together, I'm like, I don't know.
Well, if he was alive, it'd probably be pretty painful, some of the spices would react with the blood, especially like salt.
Yeah.
And all of that, all packed together. And at the moment of the resurrection, this impossible thing that could never possibly happen in all of history happens. And Jesus takes the covers off, folds up the napkin. It's all neatly laid out that was over his face, and walks out of the tomb. And I just get blown away. There were Roman soldiers watching the tomb. And they were so frightened by what they saw that they fell with their faces in the dirt and pretended to be dead. Now this is totally pretend. Do not write this down anywhere, because if somebody knows that I've said this, they may arrest me for being a heretic.
Do we want to stop the recording?
We'll edit it out.
Cut it. In the Garden of Eden, we had a problem, and mankind sinned. Do you remember what God put at the entrance to the garden? Where
Angel of death.
God lived?
Or an angel
Flaming sword.
flaming sword, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
A seraphim. Mm-hmm. What did he have in his hand?
Sword.
Interesting. You need to go back and look at Genesis and say, wow, I didn't know that was there. What is that? What does he have in his hand? It's a sword of fire. It's a flaming sword of fire. I think he came back on Easter Sunday morning. He was sitting there on that stone, looking at those soldiers and saying, come on, give me a shot. Just try me. I think the man that God sent to roll back the stone and sit there, he'd been sitting on guard before. And those guys were not going to take him on for 1 second. Now that's me, and that doesn't mean anything. You didn't hear from, Central Scripture. This is just us talking, all right? But when you see somebody that has lived in a state of war almost their entire life, they've seen every weapon that's ever come onto the battlefield. And this is not a whole army. This is just one guy. And he scares you so badly as a whole group. I mean, I don't know whether there was 3 or 5 or 7 or what, but there was a whole group that pretended to be dead. They were looking at something pretty incredible. Okay? See why I love to teach about Jesus? Why I love to talk about who he was and